This is the entrance to the city of Basra.
Here we are in Habila, a village that has not had any food distribution since June.
When the families have finished looking at the names that are posted on those boards, they come here. This is now a memorial to the victims of the Srebrenica massacre. Where in the Quran does it justify the killing of innocents? Christiane Amanpour, CNN, with elements of the Galilee division in Israel. I'm Christiane Amanpour in Iran, in Amsterdam, Jerusalem, Washington, D.C. So come with me around the world. Oh my God, what a mess. How do you teach your surviving children not to hate? We're very interested to see what's going on here.
This is it. Mandela with Walter Sisulu.
Prime Minister, welcome to the program. President Barzani, Aung San Suu Kyi, Ambassador Brahimi, Rasa Mashallah. Mr. President, thank you for joining me. Welcome to our program. Thank you very much for being with us. It's not hypothetical. It is a clear red line. I want to know your position on the Holocaust. Do you accept what it was? Is it different being a woman president? You still have huge dreams. They didn't take that away from you. She says yes, women are the future. I can't believe I nearly let that go. Yes, please tell. We sit here, the whole world is waiting for the birth of Kate and William's child. Are you excited about the baby?
Not terribly.
Why not? Are you the person who can forge a peace deal?
Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us today. Despite the weather, it's been pretty rough, but thank you all for coming out. We have a really good audience tonight. Today it's my great pleasure and honor to introduce one of the most prominent journalists of our time. Her illustrious career finds its roots in the 1980s when she began work as an entry-level assistant at an NBC affiliate in Providence, Rhode Island. She was tasked with creating graphics for local news shows and compiling weather reports into interactive diagrams. While she made many mistakes on the job, and found herself being called out on air by local weathermen. She was eventually able to work her way up until the local news station's director suggested she look into working for a fledgling news network called CNN. In 1983, she was hired onto the International Assignment Desk in Atlanta and quickly worked her way up to correspondent in CNN's New York bureau before becoming an international correspondent in 1990. Her meteoric rise brought her to the front lines of in every major world news event and hotspot, including, bear with me here, Iraq, Afghanistan, North Korea, the Palestinian territories, Iran, Sudan, Israel, Pakistan, Somalia, Rwanda, the Balkans, Egypt, Libya, and all throughout Europe and the United States of America. During her combined tenures at CNN and ABC News, she interviewed most of the world's top leaders. She has earned every major journalism award, including 11 Emmy Awards, 4 Peabody Awards, and a Giants of Broadcasting honor. She's a commander of the Most Excellent Order of the British Empire, a citation bestowed by Queen Elizabeth II in 2007, and she's a board member of the Committee to Protect Journalists and the International Women's Media Foundation. She's also an honorary citizen of the city of Sarajevo for her personal commitment to spreading the truth. Please join me in welcoming the legendary Christiane Amanpour.
Thank you. We have the expert here to connect us so that everybody gets what we're doing on tape, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you for having me, first and foremost. Thank you for asking me.
It's a very big pleasure to have you.
To be here. There she is, my friend Caroline McGee, a second-year student here at St. Andrews, who's instrumental in my appearance here today. So you have her to blame. It's wonderful to be at St. Andrews. The last time I was in Scotland was in Edinburgh during the referendum, which was 2 months ago. And just talking with the students and the members of the committee before coming out here, I just suddenly got a great nostalgia for being back at university and recalling how much I learned and absorbed and how much fun I had while I was doing it, and how practically everything that I lapped up during my university years has been incredibly useful in all the intervening years and remains useful to this day. So just to say that you are obviously in a great place. You're very fortunate to have this unbelievable start in an academic or scientific or economic or political or journalistic or medical or whatever future that you choose for yourself. And apparently I'm going to talk a little bit, and then Omar's going to talk to me, and then you guys are going to ask whatever questions you want, because I think it's cool, especially in a university setting, to hear from you students who have so much on your minds, and I'm open to any questions that you might have. I would like to say, having waxed lyrical about my wonderful experience at university, that I'm actually a little bit of an academic failure. I did very well at university and graduated very well. However, the reason I'm a journalist is because I failed to get the right grades in my A-levels when I was at boarding school here in England. I wanted to be a doctor, I thought. And I actually did very well up into my O-levels, very well in the sciences that you have to be a doctor. And then I changed schools, and I didn't do well. So I found myself at the age of, 18 or whatever age, I can't remember, 17, 18, when you leave school, not knowing what to do with my life. And I sort of wandered around a bit. In the intervening, year, there was a revolution in my home country, Iran, so that sort of focused me a little bit. And I really didn't know what to do, so I did the typical. I did a little bit of bartending, which I didn't like. I preferred to clean the pub rather than tend behind the bar. I did some retail. I was a sales assistant in Phoenix in Bond Street. I did a little bit of work as an assistant photographer, which I thought at the time was, it was pretty difficult work, but now I'm so thrilled because just holding his bag around England, I actually got to see every single privately owned Henry Moore sculpture. The photographer was doing a book for Henry Moore's 80th birthday, and that was, wow, what a privilege, because now you go to university, museums and you see them there. So I saw all those in private. And then I decided that actually the revolution in Iran was a game changer, not just for my country and my family and my friends, but for me in terms of defining my view about what the future would be for me. And obviously beginning to define my worldview and my political conscience and consciousness too. So I thought, well, hey, I wanted to be a doctor, I can't be. I'm going to make a living telling people about the very stories that have just affected my life. In other words, crisis, revolution. I didn't realize war and famine and genocide and all of that would follow, but it did. And I thought, well, in order to do that, I'm going to go to the United States of America. So here was I, this English Iranian, deciding in, I think it was 1980, to go to the United States because that is where, I had heard that if you have an ambition, if you have a goal, and if you're ready to roll up your sleeves and work really hard to make your dream come true, it would happen in the United States of America. So, sight unseen, off I went. Didn't know anybody, really. Little bit. Had some friends, Iranians, who happened to end up in, on the East Coast. Many of them went to Brown or Boston universities, some New York universities. And I didn't have any money. My parents' money was frozen in Iran, and so I couldn't pay for an Ivy League. They couldn't pay for an Ivy League education. And I ended up going to the University of Rhode Island, which was a state school, and much cheaper. Still foreigners had to pay. My grandmother, and here's my tribute to the family who helps you along the way, my grandmother and my great aunt coughed up for my fees. And I hope I repaid them by going on and making use of my degree. So during the time at university, I did what, I don't know whether you all do this, but I took my internships. I was at a radio station, which was a university radio station. Then I went to this NBC affiliate. And I did have a lot of trouble with the weather, and I cannot believe I'm here on the rainiest, windiest, hurricaniest day, and fitting. I didn't wear my combat gear, and I'm sloshing around in my, in the rain. But hey, it's great.
Stick around for Welly Ball tomorrow.
Stick around for Welly Ball. Yeah, I've just been listening to stories about Welly Ball. But I feel like I'm slightly the accidental journalist because the way I came to it was an accident of fate and politics that were way beyond my control. The way I got my various jobs were by the kindness of strangers. For instance, at this at this station that I was interning at, they said to me, hey, we've heard, they knew I wanted to be a foreign correspondent, and I wasn't getting anywhere applying to the big networks. At that time, it was the big three, CBS, ABC, NBC. And they were like, well, hang on a second, you haven't done anything in your life. You haven't done anything in your career. Why are we going to hire you? And I had, as you can tell, a non-American accent. And I was not the traditional, and we're talking about 1980 now, where if there were women on camera, they were generally Midwestern, blonde, blue-eyed, and very sort of palatable to the wider United States. There was no ethnicity. There was no ethnicity practically on camera back then. Very, very little.
Wow. And
certainly no British accents. But this guy, director at the station there, said, we've heard some British accents at CNN, and at that time it may be difficult for you to comprehend now because CNN is part of the zeitgeist and part of all of our lives, and it created 24/7 news and all that, and global television news. We were the first. And so they said, well, we've heard some English accents there, so off I went down there. So basically, a long way of saying I entered at the very, very ground level, and I moved my way up by sheer dint of wanting it and working hard and being willing to come in at all times of night and day, weekends, extra shifts, all the rest of it, to teach myself, to learn on the job, and to put myself in a position that when there were, spaces to fill and promotions to be had, I would insist that I took those places. It was Caroline's mum, Liza, who got me my first job in New York. She was the manager of the station there, even though she's my own age. She was a very young manager. And that's where I got my first job as a reporter and a producer. And from there, then again, Dead Man's Shoes, a few years later, in 1990, they had offered a different correspondent a job that was going as a foreign correspondent, and he turned it down, and I went, I'll go. And I went. And what happened a couple of months after I went to Frankfurt, it happened to be, before I even got an apartment or bought bed linen or anything like that, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. And that was the beginning of my career. So I got on the first plane to Dubai, actually, because you couldn't go anywhere else. You couldn't go to Kuwait. The airspace was all closed because it had just been invaded. You definitely couldn't go to Iraq, a dictatorship, an iron-fisted dictatorship, which didn't just allow journalists. It's not like, going to Dublin. You couldn't go to Baghdad. And we all gathered, all the world's journalists gathered first as the first launch place was in Dubai, which then in 1991 was nothing like it is today. I mean, today it's a major financial hub and a major, economic capital. And then it was a fishing village. It really was. And then from there we started going to Saudi Arabia, Baghdad, elsewhere, and started to cover the war. And then that's how my career proceeded. The next was the Balkans, where I believe that I was formed really in the Balkans. I was shaped by what I saw, which was an unfolding ethnic cleansing, which led to genocide, and it forced me to make critical judgments about what I was seeing and about how I would tell that story. And it wasn't enough to say on the one hand, on the other hand, because there wasn't an on the one hand, on the other hand. There was one hand which was slaughtering the other hand. Yeah. And if I didn't stand up and say it as it was, I judged that I would be an accomplice and I would be perpetrating basically a crime. And this was a very, again, turning point moment for me, because we should not, as fact-based journalists, which I consider myself, be opinion mongers. That's for a whole different side that's the opinions, that's columns, that's editorials. That's not what I do. But I didn't think I was giving my opinion. I was telling the truth about what was going on, which so happened to be a massive violation of all international law and all international humanitarian law, not to mention the Geneva Conventions and all the rest of it. So I told that story, and it was very difficult because it was at a time when the United States, Britain, France, all the powers didn't want to intervene to stop it. And in the end, we journalists, I believe, and I feel this was a triumph for journalists of my generation, we managed to tell the story to such effect that in the end, our democratically elected governments, who had to respond to this flagrant violation, not just of democratic principles, but of human rights and rule of law. They had to respond to it. They could not continue to watch this unfold. And so they did intervene in the end, 4 years after the war in the Balkans started, and they stopped it, and today the Balkans is at peace. Yep. And that for us is a triumph. The flip side to that is at the same time, kind of, in Rwanda, 1994, there was a massive genocide, the fastest slaughter of human beings ever in our modern history, by primitive weapons. They were machetes and clubs. And journalists weren't there en masse at the beginning. And it took 3 months. It was very short, much shorter than the Balkans, obviously, which took 3.5, 4 years. And so politicians were able to look aside with impunity and were able not to intervene because we weren't all there to hold them accountable for what was going on. And so we also have that on our conscience. And these are very heavy things to deal with. So what we do, if we do it well, is very difficult, very serious, very consequential, for good and for bad. And therefore a huge responsibility on our shoulders. And that's how I see my job, and how I see even today, when I'm not as much in the field, although I still do, I bring 20 years of field experience into the studio with my nightly show now, and I try to hold world leaders accountable for what's going on, bringing to the table the experience that I've had, seeing this stuff unfold in the field, and they all know it. Mm-hmm. So they know that they can't pull a fast one on me. They know that I'm going to ask the tough questions. Sometimes they don't answer, sometimes they don't agree to be interviewed. But if they agree to be interviewed, they know that I'm going to hold their feet to the fire and ask the tough questions. And so that's what I'm doing now.
Wow. I think... So the question becomes, you hit on this point of the media being able to direct the dialogue. And with something like, it's the CNN effect to an extent, which is an academic term really that's been coined to call what CNN does in bringing attention to international problems, especially with respect to natural disasters and genocides, that sort of thing. It's a new thing, and it really does bring a lot of attention to these conflicts. I think the number is that after the tsunami in Japan, $500 per person that was a victim was raised because of the CNN effect, whereas the Ugandan civil war, 18 years long, 50p per person was raised just because it wasn't covered to the same extent. Yep. So what degree do you think the media, to what degree do you think the media has a role in shaping international policy?
I think you labeled this the media circus, inside the media circus, so that in some instances, there is a real media circus. In other words, stories that draw the world's press, not just all the US press, not just television press, but radio and newspapers and everything from all over the world, and it becomes a media circus. And sometimes that can move the ball along, and sometimes that can completely smother what the real story is and make it difficult to cut through the noise and the hubbub. I think, one of the things that people ask us a lot is, how do you choose to go where you go? What do you choose to do? And you mentioned, Fukushima and the tsunami there. We could talk about the tsunami back in Southeast Asia in 2004 versus the Uganda Civil War. I mean, you're absolutely right. The Uganda Civil War got no attention because it wasn't mediatic. It was difficult to get to. It was very much more dangerous. Some of us covered certain aspects of it, but certainly in no way with the same heft and commitment. That is a problem, I have to say. I don't know whether there are any Africans in this room, but many Africans ask me, why do you only treat us as a crisis zone? Why do you only come to us when we have Ebola or a famine or the Lord's Resistance Army, Joseph Kony or whatever it is? And it's an honest question, and it's a problem for us. We don't cover Africa. The whole world's press does not cover Africa as it should cover Africa. Now, Al Jazeera does a pretty good job of it. I think they've made a commitment to sort of fill some of the gaps that some of the Western press doesn't fill. But it's a very good question to ask. What makes us cover, something over another? I will say that we did all cover the good news story that was in South Africa during the period of the end of apartheid, the beginning of democracy, the rise of Nelson Mandela, equality, and all the rest of it. That was, again, in 1994, and a lot has happened since. So, we can put it down to resources, we can put it down to a number of things. But we can also put it down to, there are these obvious things that crop up. What happened in Fukushima was not just a tsunami, but it was the possibility of nuclear fallout and nuclear contamination. And, everybody was pretty freaked out about what happened there, including myself. I can be very frank with you. I have no problem going to war zones, but I draw a line when it gets to nuclear fallout. And I said, I have a child, and I am not going into a radiation zone. So I went to Japan, and I went close, but I didn't get so close that the Geiger counter was going off. And I made that decision, and it was a few years ago, so I had risen to a level in my business that I could tell them that listen, if you want to send me, I'd rather not go, but if you want to send me, I'll go, but I won't go any further than this. So that's what happened.
Well, what I was going to say is that you can say that there is a little bit of a logic behind covering something like Fukushima, but then not talking about Uganda because Uganda is a little bit harder to explain and because the ramifications aren't as wide-reaching across the international boundaries. But then CNN does things like covering Casey Anthony for weeks and months, the Casey Anthony murder trial, which was a big, really media-ized murder trial that was covered for so long, even though it didn't have any effect on the public.
Well,
is it ratings driven?
Yes, of course, that's not my job or my business, and I proudly put a wall between myself and that kind of stuff, because I think it's rubbish too. However, you just have to look around in any country, in any place. There's the stuff that interests people in a tabloid way. I call it high and low. Society is like that from time immemorial. People have liked gossip. People have liked scandal. People have liked, all sorts of titillation, including dramatic murder trials. They may not have a blind bit of difference or impact on society at large, but some people find them interesting. What you're talking about is a trial that was covered on our USA network, not on our global network. Maybe there was a little bit about it when I can't remember, but I don't think so. So it was covered for our US viewers. Non-stop. And by the way, I think was I living in the US then? I probably was. So I think I was at ABC at that time. I had a short detour between my tours of duty at CNN to ABC to embed myself in one of the commercial networks and see what it was like. They did it very heavily, and it became their signature. So everybody was doing it. But yes, it was too much. And again, that was a major media circus, which had zero impact on anything. That and who remembers the Casey Anthony trial today? Nobody.
But it's not something that happened once, and it's not just a US-based thing. You have MH370.
Yes, well, that was important. Oh, MH370, sorry.
Yeah, not MH17. It's the one that went missing.
Well, I'll give you the clear answer to that, because I know what you're going to say, because we've been criticized for it a lot.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Over the years, there's been a bigger melding of CNN domestic with CNN international on certain stories such as this. And as all of you remember, I'm sure, for weeks we were all transfixed. Where is this plane? How is it possible that in this 21st century, where you can go anywhere, anytime, with any probe, with any microphone, with any digital technology, you don't know where this plane is? No, it can't be true. Nobody could believe it. Who could believe it? I couldn't believe it. But then it became ridiculous. And then we went on and on and on. So did a lot of other people, but we did. But I will tell you this, that we went on and on and on because it was great for our ratings, which meant it brought a lot of money, which meant, and this is painful to admit, but it's true, and I'm being very honest, which meant that we were able to gather a huge amount of ads and money and revenue and all the rest of it. And CNN was going through a little bit of a rocky time at the time. So what happens to CNN is that people flock to us when stuff's happening. Whether it's MH17 or Russia going into Ukraine or Ebola or whatever it might be, ISIS, all of that. And you can say, well, you shouldn't do it or not, but people are fascinated by those things. Yes, MH370 probably went on for too long. But MH17, was a legitimate story of aggression against a civilian airliner. And actually, the two were sort of, it was a crazy story. How could two Malaysian airliners, disappear, within several months of each other? So yeah, I mean, there are criticisms, and that's part of the media circus business.
This kind of leads me into a question that was posed by someone in the audience yesterday when we sent out an email asking for questions. So you've previously stated that the news is not supposed to be entertainment. Rather, it serves to reveal the truth. New digital media outlets such as BuzzFeed and Vice seek to combine entertainment and news to attract readers and have done so with great success. BuzzFeed's news team has a staff including some former New York Times writers, for example. What is the role of the 24/7 news channels in this new media landscape, and how should they compete with these new forms of media?
It's not just 24/7 news channels. I think it's what is the role of the traditional, how we understand journalism to be. So what do I understand journalism to be? Yes, we have citizen journalism now. Yes, we have social media. Yes, we have Twitter that passes for journalism and information, but it's not. Yes, we have armchair warriors who are busy blogging, but what are they blogging about? They're blogging about what I do in the field. They couldn't blog if people like us didn't go out there and bring back stuff that they could then busy give their armchair opinion on. It kind of drives me crazy, but content is content, and that's what we are. So that's our role. That's our role. And without us going there... Sorry, yes, Vice does. I was just sort of going from blogging to this. Now, Vice. Vice, okay, it's true that I don't look at it all the time, but some of the stuff that I've looked at is okay. How much did we learn from Dennis Rodman being in North Korea? And in the end, that was Vice. Yeah. And in the end, how interesting was it? Frankly, I found it cringeworthy. This paragon of American sports, the capitalist system, this rich guy going there bowing and, kowtowing to this dictator Kim Jong-un. What was the point of all of that? Really, what was the point of that? For me, I don't know what they were doing. Was it a commercial enterprise? Was Dennis Rodman trying to... I have no idea what they were doing there. But that wasn't journalism. So if Vice, in that regard, was trying to, entertain us, it was entertaining up to a point. It's a bit like MH370. Yeah. I got so tired of seeing Dennis Rodman, happy birthday, to the dictator. I mean, come on, have some self-respect, man.
You heard it here first.
I mean, really. Okay. I mean, really. And Dennis Rodman, comes from a tradition of his ancestors were are you going to show it up here? His ancestors came from the worst kind of slavery and oppression, right? And he's busy kowtowing to somebody who's perpetrating that on his own people right now. Sorry. That's weird.
But it gets the ratings.
And there was no accountability. They didn't even mention that. So no, I didn't think that Vice did a great job there.
But they end up stealing CNN viewers, and that's
do they?
The thing.
I don't know. Do they?
I mean, BuzzFeed is so much bigger.
Bigger than CNN?
Not bigger than CNN.
Omar.
But I mean, BuzzFeed does have a wide-reaching audience.
Does it?
And the youth, I think.
How wide?
I don't know. You tell me. How many people here in the audience look at BuzzFeed at all? And then how many people check out more traditional news sources more regularly than BuzzFeed?
How many go to CNN.com or BBC.com?
More often than BuzzFeed?
Okay, it's about the same number of hands went up, wouldn't you say?
Yeah. BuzzFeed versus CNN would be different.
Sorry?
I was just saying that he said, if I look at something on BuzzFeed, maybe I want to look at, I'm trying to write an essay and I want to think of something completely mindless and look at a funny picture of a dog.
Right. Precisely. It's high, low. Exactly. Yeah. So for me, it's not competition.
Okay.
For me, it's not on my radar. Stupidly, maybe, but I'm kind of an old news kind of person. I'm so busy just trying to get the exclusive interviews. So I look at it, and it comes into my stratosphere thanks to my excellent digital producers and social media producers and this and that. But it's not necessarily where I go to get my news. And I will say one thing. As a fact-based journalism of the old school, which I'm proud to be, mind you, I have an exceptionally successful website. So I'm pretty much in the news. I'm in the news zone as well. I'm not a complete dinosaur. There is a lot of rubbish that goes on some of this social media that we then have to spend so much time and waste time chasing it down only to knock it down.
Yeah.
So it's a problem as well as being, it's good and it's bad.
But you're not competing, is what you're saying.
I'm not. Maybe others, maybe CNN is, but they haven't told me.
This leads me into another audience-led question, audience-submitted question. Social media has taken on the role of a current affairs platform, with people using it to express and debate everything from politics to global epidemics. Recently, we've seen the rise of hashtag campaigns such as Kony 2012, Bring Back Our Girls, and Shake Off Ebola, all of which seem to imply that engaging with these highly complicated crises with a 5-second retweet counts as a satisfactory advocacy.
Got it.
Do you think social media activism is something our society should fear?
Okay, so this is, I find, a really interesting phenomenon, because I'd said about Lord's Resistance Army, that's Joseph Kony, right? So Joseph Kony, I'd been reporting on Joseph Kony back in 1994, and I followed the nun who went off to the whole story about those girls who were taken, and I had this amazing interview with the lovely little Italian nun, Sister Rachele, who I remember to this day, who went off into the wilderness to get her girls back. And actually a very good new book has been written by a friend of mine, actually, Susan Minot, called, I think it's called Only 30 or 30 Girls or something, because she was only able to bring back 30 girls. She negotiated with this horrendous Joseph Kony, wacko, to get back 30 out of the 100 girls or so. And it was a real moral quandary for her and a dilemma. How could she, leave the other girls? In any event, it was really dramatic. But in our television world at that time, it didn't really have a massive ripple effect around the world. Then comes, many years later, this Stop Kony video, right? The video, which has something like, I think, more than 100 million hits on YouTube, something like that. Wow. Yeah. Wow. But they had an activism attached to it, which was that apparently 2 weeks after that, everybody was meant to gather in the streets, university students, high school students, people around the world, I believe, were meant to gather in the streets. That's what it was.
Paint the night.
Yes.
Yeah.
To stop Kony and have this amazing thing. So what happened? Nothing happened.
The guy went crazy.
Well, yeah, but nothing happened.
Yeah.
Nobody came out in the streets. My friends who told me that their kids were all going to come out on the streets and, miss their classes and this, that, didn't come out on the streets. So what does that mean? It was my first realization that, social media hashtag activism is not an adequate replacement for real, genuine activism, because social media is 20 miles wide and a centimeter deep. What it does is get us all excited for 15 days, and then what? And then we move on to the next one. That's a real problem for those of our people in society who actually want to change society. It's a real problem, because what it means is they're putting their political finger in the wind, and they're saying, oh, this week we've got to talk about Uganda. And oh, next week let's talk about Ebola. They were so late on the Ebola crisis. And I don't even know whether it was because of hashtags that they started sending troops and this and that. But they were so late. So in other words, I don't think hashtag activism, maybe some of you have an example you can point to that actually did do something good. It's not an alternative to real political activism. And on top of that, what's even worse, it can have the effect of removing the imperative to actually have good policy, because people then are just concerned. It's the nth degree to soundbite policy, right? Soundbite was on television, and that had a certain spill. This hashtag is on social media, which has a much wider, net. So policymakers are left doing basically nothing.
But I think it's a reflection of society's attempt to
simplify
simplify
and short attention span, and and a short attention span. This, I'm very worried, for instance, about my son's generation growing up looking at this thing. Because I've read enough about it to know that actually at a certain age it is rewiring the brain, and it is causing the whole synapse situation to be much less deep and much quicker and much more, fragmented. And this is what we're seeing, a fragmented social discussion around hashtags today. It might be, I don't know, semicolons tomorrow. I don't know.
But how do you take these big issues?
Well, I'm in there trying to do it on CNN, which still has a very big worldwide audience, do it on my website, and do it through coverage on the ground, which there is no, in my view, there's no replacement for that. You really must go into the field to find out what's going on, and interviewing the principals.
So another question that came from the audience: what is an issue that you think doesn't get enough attention from the media?
Golly, lots. Just so many. I don't know. Just so many don't get enough attention. Half of these things that we've just been talking about that have been social media phenomenon, even though those don't get enough attention from the media / the policymakers. I mean, what have I been fascinated by this week, which has actually got a lot of attention, but in an era where NASA is slashing its budget, suddenly we've been treated to another 24/7, but suddenly we've been reacquainted with what I call the breathtaking scope of human ingenuity. To have that Rosetta spacecraft land on a speeding comet for the first time ever, a 10-year process. Did anybody know this was going on before 2-3 days ago? I didn't know. I didn't know. Okay.
Got a couple of people.
Good. Yeah. Is that because you're in science? Yes? Well, I find it absolutely fascinating, absolutely fascinating, and the it's just phenomenal what people can do and what scientific brains can do. So I think maybe science doesn't get enough media attention. We're all talking about disasters and this and that. I think another thing that doesn't get enough media attention is when policies go right and the success of policies. And I think one of the other things which I think is very dangerous, people have asked me often who are the leaders I most respect around the world right now. And honestly, and it's not an arrogant thing, I cannot name very many right now. Or any.
Not one.
Nope. Dead ones, yes. Recently dead. But I mean, Nelson Mandela, Václav Havel. I actually quite admire the new, very young Prime Minister of Italy because he's trying to buck the system. And that's a weird thing to say because, as you know, Italy has had almost a Prime Minister every month for the last 45 years. But this guy is really trying to make a difference. I admire some of the leaders in Tunisia who've actually shown that not the whole Arab Spring is a complete disaster, that they've actually been able to show how you must be able to compromise between the various different branches of society, whether it's secular or religious or whatever it might be, which is very difficult, so I admire them. But everywhere you look, whether it's Syria or Iran or China or wherever, Russia, I mean, can we talk about Russia?
We're on camera.
It's a terrible thing. No, but I mean, it's a terrible thing what's going on. And many of you probably are studying international relations and international affairs. For the first time since the Second World War, you've got two nuclear-armed forces pitted against each other, and who knows what hair trigger might set it off. Up until now, Putin has been mucking around with Ukraine, swallowing up Crimea despite an international treaty that Russia signed in 1994, which guarantees Ukraine's borders. Russia signed it, along with Britain and the United States, and I think maybe France. But anyway, Russia signed it. It was obligated to do it. So he's going back to the law of the jungle, rejecting the rule of law and international law, and the principle of a big country gobbling up a smaller country. That's what he's done. That's what he's done. And now there are more forces going into eastern Ukraine again. So that's one thing. And by the way, Would he have dared do it? And the reason why they signed this protection of Ukraine is because after the fall of the Soviet Union, Ukraine, which housed a huge proportion of the Soviet Union's nuclear weapons, gave them away, gave them up to Central Command and to be destroyed or disarmed and housed. So they now don't have their nuclear deterrent. So Russia is behaving badly.
Yeah.
But,
to say the least.
But the Baltic states are NATO members. So Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. United States, Britain, NATO is Article 5 means that they have to defend. If Russia does anything to those states, they have to go in and defend those states. Not a pretty thought.
Yeah. I mean, we hear
that's
a lot.
happening right now.
Yeah. We were talking about this earlier. We see a lot of these doom and gloom scenarios unfolding around the world, and the news has been hammering it in, whether it's ISIS or Ebola or Russia or MH370 even. You have all these bad stories all the time. Do you think the world is now more dangerous and more violent than it ever has been?
No, I don't know about ever has been, but certainly since I've started covering international affairs. And I tell you why. It is the breakdown of a lot of established order in your region. The Arab world has suddenly started to break down during the Arab Spring with very little coherent policy or framework for going forward. So as that political drama takes place in the North African Arab states, in Syria, Iraq, etc., the state is collapsing. And the vacuum is being filled by the worst of the worst. These people are even worse than Al-Qaeda. I mean, who thought that we'd say that? I was in Iraq in 2003, for the whole war and everything else, and I, watched ISIS predecessor, which was called AQIM, Al-Qaeda in Mesopotamia, behead civilians. And now we're seeing it all over again. Only the difference this time is that they have territory. I mean, look at the paper. Every day they're doing something new. They want their own currency. They have their own anthem. They have their own recruiting. They have territory. They have their own base they are self-financing through black market selling of oil that they've managed to capture and other things such as hostages and, taking tolls on roads, all that kind of, extortion and protection rackety thing that these people do. And it is very, very dangerous to the point that, the United States, Britain, others, they've obviously had to go back in and use air power, but everybody knows it's not going to be done with just air power. So the next thing is, are we going to see our forces back in Iraq anytime soon? And so that is incredibly dangerous, and it is nothing that we've seen before. We've never seen this idea of a caliphate, which, by the way, is completely contradictory to the real idea of the Islamic Caliphate. If you go back to when it was in the Middle Ages, it was actually fairly tolerant compared to the other big religions and powers. It was a very different issue and highly educated and highly scientific and literary and cultural. And this is just nihilism. But they have territory, and that's very, 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 very dangerous. And I believe, because I've been covering it, and nobody really wanted to admit this, but pulling out of Iraq too soon created the vacuum. Not going in to stop the Syrian bloodshed when it could have been done much, much easier 3 or 4 years ago. And I don't even mean by going in, not by Western forces going in, just by aiding and abetting the moderate forces who are aligned with the West. Let them do their fight. They were doing it quite well. By not doing that, the massive vacuum that's been created in Syria has enabled ISIS to flourish. So this is very dangerous. It's a consequence of the troubles in that region, but also a failure of Western leadership. And whether we like it or not, the fact of the matter is that, liberal democracies and, liberal, neoliberal economies and that's the way of the world.
You've sat down with Bashar al-Assad.
Yes, but before this, in 2005,
What did you think of him?
I thought he was quite weak. If you look at him, he has a very weak chin. He's very tall and lanky. He speaks decent English with a lisp. It's not his fault, but it doesn't sound good from a leader. And he's shown himself to be weak and ruthless. And the two are very dangerous. If you're weak and unsure of yourself and not sure of your power and you're ruthless, this is what happens. Or or he's, but some people say, well, he was such a reformer, you know, he was an ophthalmologist, he studied in England, look, his wife is so chic and beautiful, and they have their Instagram site, and, you know, they're having, you know, parties in Damascus. But doesn't matter, when push came to shove, he became tribal, and he is his father. Bashar Assad, the president of Syria, who, yes, I mean, as you all know, he assumed power when his father died in 2000. He wasn't the chosen one. He was the default son. The one who Hafez wanted to succeed him was the older brother who got killed in a car accident. Yeah.
So, I mean,
there's a question there. Oh, sorry, where are we in this? Sorry, I just saw a hand go up.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
It's your show, Omar. You do what you want.
No, go ahead. Go ahead. Go ahead.
The why is interesting. The yes, I do believe, but now they've had to stiffen their spine. You've seen it. They're gradually stiffening their spine because they can see that even, you know, something has to happen right now. I mean, as one neocon, and I'm not a neocon, but as this guy Fred Hoff, or no, not Hoff, somebody else in the New York Times said, if you do not confront ISIS, it means that you accept this brutal, violent, barbaric caliphate. I mean, when we saw our colleagues being beheaded, do I think that should be a casus belli? Not necessarily, but it did galvanize people. But if you don't confront them, that means you accept them. It's one or the other, right? If you don't push them back, your policy is that you accept them. And it has huge ripple effects. I think the why was mostly in reaction to George Bush's administration, which came from here and pushed the pendulum of intervention all the way to here. And the world was furious by the time at the end of the administration, everywhere. In the United States, Tony Blair, here in Britain, people were furious at him. All over the region, people were furious. Obama comes in 2008 with a political platform that's about ending these wars. I think to be not Bush and to regain America's good name and position and credibility in the world, but also because he genuinely believes that. He is not an interventionist. So instead of Obama bringing the pendulum to here, he took it all the way to here. And that's a problem. Because what did that do? That meant that he took all the troops out of Iraq. And the excuse was that, oh, we didn't have a SOFA, it means an agreement, a status of forces agreement. We couldn't get the Iraqi parliament to agree. And as we can see, they're in there now without a SOFA. So that was an excuse. There are ground forces and air forces in Iraq right now with no such SOFA, no such agreement. So he wanted them out. And that result meant that you had no, you had nobody keeping an eye on the Iraqi forces, you had nobody keeping the training up, you had nobody, and this is crucial, keeping the political factions together, and therefore the political prime minister at the time was the Shiite Maliki, who started to act like an authoritarian, sectarian dictator. And that, the combination of a breakdown of security and a breakdown of political consensus, meant that the Sunnis, in the words of one Sunni leader, had nothing to fight for. So they didn't believe themselves to be part of the state anymore. And so when ISIS came down the road, and their leaders, by the way, were former Sunnis, former Saddam army people, former Baathists. I mean, it is extraordinary what they've been able to do. And because nobody was in there, nobody saw it. But we knew what was happening in Syria. I mean, truly, the Iraq thing caught everybody by surprise. It shouldn't have done, but it did. The Syria thing we knew because I've been reporting it forever, and I've got myself into quite a lot of trouble on certain shows on our network which were about opinion and commentary and explaining. I said all this stuff, and I was shouted down, but all the time, by the people who right now are, having to answer for explaining this away. And it's really hard now, because what they could have done 3 or 4 years ago is now going to take, many, many years longer, much, much more difficult if they succeed at all. So it's very, very bad position to be in. And
I'm not a sort of a weekend warrior, but I do think that if you're the United States of America and you are the superpower, you have to have, your finger in a lot of pots, which doesn't mean to say invading, but at least, keep your word. 3-4 years ago, you said Assad has to go. You said there was a red line. I mean, none of these things were matched. And these, if the West doesn't pay much attention to it, there they pay a lot of attention. They say, and Putin says, oh, well, President Obama said there was a red line, but then he didn't, act on it when it was crossed. President Obama said Assad has to go. Well, Assad is still there. Oh, President Obama says I have to get out of eastern Ukraine. Why would he believe him? This is the problem.
I think now would be a good time to open up the forum for questions from the audience. So I'll just be pointing, and then we'll have people. We don't have mics, so please project.
Okay.
Raise your hands high, and we'll take your question right there.
Has spending a lot of time in conflict zones changed your opinions or convinced you more on either the legitimacy or the necessity of military intervention?
Yes. First of all, I didn't really have opinions before I went in. I really learned everything as it was unfolding. It was like an education in process. And 20 years of doing it has sort of formulated kind of my worldview, which is not to say I'm dogmatic and I know things change, but I do actually believe, and this happened in Bosnia, where I was confronted with it first, I do believe in the value of humanitarian intervention. But what happened to me after witnessing Afghanistan and Iraq, I then developed my belief in humanitarian intervention and intervention to prevent people like ISIS, for instance. You have to, if they're threatening you. They haven't done it right. They haven't done it well. They haven't done it with commitment. If you go back to even post-World War in Europe, Marshall Plan, they did that really well. Many years, a lot of money, but with a real direction, with a real focus. If you go online and read the US government's, it's called the GAO, the General Accounting Office reports for Iraq or Afghanistan or whatever. These are accountability reports on where money's gone and this and that. I mean, you just want to put your head in your hands and weep. Weep. Trillions of dollars. Literally down the drain. Literally. The lack of oversight, the lack of accountability, the literally tossing money and programs around that either were good at the time but wouldn't have survived the pullout of forces. Just the flagrant disregard disregard to proper policy making is just scandalous, scandalous. So these days, and I hate to say this, and it's you ask me how my view has been shaped and developed. I am now afraid to see people intervene now because I don't know if they're going to make it worse. I know that ISIS has to be confronted because I don't want to live in a place where that is, knocking on my door. But I am terrified that they won't do it right. And somehow we're going to be worse off than we were in the beginning. I'm really, really scared. Both the Bush administration and the Obama administration has screwed up post-war. America can always win a war. It's winning the peace that's the real challenge. The Iraq War, whatever it was won in three weeks. From entering Kuwait to going to Baghdad, that took 3 weeks in 2003. It's what happened afterwards that was the big disaster. And Afghanistan, which I truly believe is one of the most wonderful places in the world, I love Afghanistan, and which is where Al-Qaeda hatched and which was really a place where you had to go in and confront Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. Even there they've screwed it up so badly. But because of what's happened in Iraq, they are keeping a residual force. It's not very many, but it's better than nothing. It's like 10,000 US and NATO forces will remain in Afghanistan beyond the end of this year. This December, the majority of forces will be out. Luckily, they've had a fairly decent election. Luckily, for the moment, you've got two really top people, and I really, really think they're top people. Ashraf Ghani, who's the president, and Abdullah, who used to be the foreign minister under Karzai and was a very big force in the anti-Taliban alliance. He is the sort of second in command, kind of a new executive position that's been created because they argued about who won the election. But it's a triumph, actually, of American diplomacy that they got together. Let's hope it lasts. Let's hope it lasts. Because, you know, trying to stabilize that place is incredibly important and incredibly worthwhile. Incredibly worthwhile. Yeah.
Next question, right there.
Yeah.
Attention with pumps and sort of been happening for years. You said that you feel pumps in Africa have been underreported.
I think you're right that your place has been. I think you're right that your place has been underreported. Look, you're right. Yeah. Look, you're right. Latin America is another place that's very underreported, but CNN has, as you know, CNN Espanol, CNN. So they sort of say, oh, well, you know, that network's looking after that. But you're right, it should be much, much more reported in our English language organizations. Why did I interview Maduro then? Because, like Carrera, you know, again, I'm shocked. I mean, most of Latin America has gone democratic, and even these people, Carrera, Maduro, all these people have won by democratic process, but they're not Democrats. They then become authoritarians. So what do authoritarians do? They don't want to talk to the free press. I've been asking for years to interview Chavez and then Maduro, Correa, and any number of these leaders. And even Dilma Rousseff, the Brazilian president, Democrat, hates talking to the international press. I'm the first one, the first international television, after 4 years that she was in office, who got an interview. First. Weird. It's weird. So I'm not sure why they don't want to talk. But I agree with you, there needs to be a lot more, and it needs not just to be on immigration, it should be on, you know, politics, the economy, environment, you know, there's so many interesting things that are going on there. I interviewed the president of Uruguay, Mujica, who's a fascinating, fascinating guy, and who offered to take 6 of the Guantanamo detainees as they try to close that place down. But even that was sad because it was so bogged down in Congress for so long that by the time they sort of agreed in the US to let these people go to Uruguay, and this is where politics always plays, it became an election issue for Mujica. So he couldn't say yes by the time the US said okay. So now it's still rolling. But yeah, point taken.
Okay, next question. Right there.
I'm obsessed by this topic. I'm obsessed. The older I got, I wasn't obsessed when I was younger because I was just fighting my way to the top. And at that time, I used to say, no, there's no difference between men and women. We all have the same opportunities, and I'm not here, you know, woman, man, blah, blah, blah. But now that I have time to think from the position I've reached, I am now obsessed and doubly obsessed because, you know, last night I was in London and I went to see this play Made in Dagenham. I don't know whether any of you have heard of it, know it, whatever. It's fabulous. And it's all about equal pay for equal play in the Ford plant in Dagenham during the 70s when Harold Wilson was Prime Minister, and the bravery of the women in the factory who demanded equal pay for equal play. And I'm also friends with Billie Jean King, the great tennis player, who made that her vocation as well, having won her championships, and she got that for women. All the Grand Slams now pay equal prize money to women as men, and that's a triumph. But unfortunately, in so many other arenas, it's not the case at all, and women still earn, you know, a significant percentage less than men. So in our business, I would say the following, that you find a huge and exponentially larger number of women doing what I'm doing, doing the behind the camera stuff, the on camera stuff, but not in the executive suite. Big problem. So we have to raise women much, much, much higher and in much bigger numbers into the executive suite. In politics, and I'm talking in the West now, politics, you know, you have one female prime minister here who made her mark. You have not had a female president of the United States, but not even a female president. 51% of the American population is female, 20 or less percent of Congress is female. There is a misrepresentation in politics as well, and female or minorities of any kind, but this is the figure for females. So how do we move this ball along? Well, there are many, you know, noble efforts to do that, a lot of individual efforts. I think that having covered all this for so long and having, you know, what I call, you know, done the sort of microcredit basket weaving side of let's give women a little something to do and maybe they'll make a few pennies and, you know, blah, blah. Now we know that our society is completely unhealthy if everybody is not involved and if everybody is not contributing to the economy, and which is a reason why the Middle East, why the Muslim countries of the Arab world are not, despite their human treasure and their mineral resources, economically and developmentally ranked so low, because one of the reasons is education, the other reason is half their workforce is not empowered. So I think you have to lobby for equal pay across the board for the same job. Equal pay for equal play. And I think we all have to publish our salaries. We all have to publish our salaries and shame people into explaining why X, because he happens to have a Y chromosome, or what is the chromosome, somebody tell me, is making more than Y, you know, for doing exactly the same job. And I think that might have an impact. So I think, you know, we really have to leverage economic power. I mean, we know in the United States, for instance, that 40% of all households, the breadwinners are solely women or the majority are women. So it's a, you know, it's a big issue. And in many of our, as I say, our professions, it's still a big able
Okay, I think we have time for one more question.
How about over here? Okay,
Tom.
Tom.
Going to be a solution to the commercial influence within a free press, or do you reckon it's just a necessary evil that you have to do?
I feel, and I am afraid that it's a necessary thing that we have to deal with. I mean, look, when I watch a documentary on the BBC and I can sit for 50 minutes uninterrupted and watch a documentary, I think, wow, what a luxury. Compared to on commercial television, when you get interrupted by ads every 4 minutes or so. And it's very, very distracting. I don't know, and they haven't figured out another economic model for commercial television. I mean, at CNN, yes, we have ads, but most of our, I believe a great deal of our revenue comes from cable deals and subscriptions and all of that kind of stuff. You know, it's a hard one because I for many, many years have been on the record as saying you can't treat news and information like any other commercial commodity, like, I don't know, gym shoes or Coca-Cola or whatever. They're two different things. And I still believe that news and information should be protected under the public service, you know, rubric of our society. And I'm proud enough about the potential power of our profession, of the profession of journalism, to strongly believe that if there's good journalism, it adds to and strengthens civil society and democracies. If there is a disempowered or bad journalism, it does the opposite. It weakens. And I think that you know, all you have to do is read. I was telling one of our friends earlier today, go online and find the latest Rolling Stone magazine article about the Obama administration and the press. And it's written by an insider who was in the Obama administration communications operation, basically admitting that they can hardly govern. I mean, because they're reacting to tweets, they're reacting to social media, they're reacting to sound bites, they're reacting to 24/7, what we do, you know, and it's all reaction without being able to. And to do policy properly, and part of that is driven by money, money, money. So it's very it's a bad vicious circle, and I can't see a way out of it at the moment, to be honest.
Okay, so before we go, I just want to end on a lighter note. So I just wanted
No,
to...
let's on a positive note.
Yeah, so I was going to ask...
But all of those who want to be journalists should do it, because it is such a great profession, and it's so much fun, and it's so great to be an eyewitness and to go out there and to really cover the news and to write that first draft of history. And I know it sounds kind of, like a cliche, but it's really true. Not to take yourselves or ourselves too seriously, but understand that, you are there being the eyes and ears for those who can't or won't go out and find out themselves, but that it's a real profession. It's not a dilettante's game. It requires a lot of education and experience and seriousness, and it can really, as I say, and I've watched this on so many emerging democracies that I've covered, from all over the world, that often it's journalists who are in the forefront and on the cutting edge of democracy and reform. And that's really something that we should really understand, because this profession has so much scope for being such a very constructive part of civil society in our worlds. Yeah.
I have one final question. What's the most daring thing that you've done to get a story?
Daring. Okay. Daring. I would say two. When the Soviet Union was collapsing in 1991, Gorbachev was signing away the Soviet Union in Moscow, and all the heavyweight press were there watching him do that. And I was still fairly junior, and I got sent to the Republic of Georgia, where there was a little squabble going on. And I was so determined, and I actually was with three other women. We were an all-girl crew, and the beleaguered president was in a dungeon in his sort of presidential palace, and there was, major tank fire and war and this and that going on. I said, we've got to get the interview. We've got to get this interview. We've got to get this interview, otherwise we're not going to get a look in on CNN today. And we literally ran across the open courtyard and dodged all these bullets to get there. And then we couldn't get the damn interview out because there were no satellites and there were no planes or anything going from Georgia to Moscow because there was a big crisis. So we had to wait for the next day to get the report out, and we missed our deadline. But nonetheless, that was pretty daring. And then subsequently in Bosnia, there was a lot more, but it's all sort of now, it's all so much, I don't pass it anymore because it's all been pretty daring. And if I told any one of the stories, it would be, people think I was a complete nutcase. But when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, by the time we got to Saudi Arabia, me and my team, and this is something that just happened, but I love it. It was me and a female camera woman and a female sound woman editor. So we were an all-girls team in an all-man's country. And we managed to convince one of these princes to put us in the car and took us up to the front, and we got the first and only pictures of the tanks that were in the no man's land zone between Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. And when we got back, our much more seasoned, much more veteran and more grizzled male colleagues were practically ready to shoot us. So that was one of my first and early feelings of pride.
All right, let's give her a round of applause, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all for coming out in the rain. It was fun.
All right. Wow. What an incredible time. I have no words.
You enjoy it?
It was really, really, really fun.
Good. It was fun for you. You did a great job on that.
Thank you so much.
Hi. Thank you so much for your talk. I really enjoyed it.
Are you feeling around as well?
Yes. I was just
Thanks. Okay.
gotta get some better ones.
What?
You gotta get some better ones. It's too far.
Of us sitting down? No, she has to catch her breath.
Like right now?
Yeah.
Just like get your photos right now. Get a photo with it together.
Of who?
Yes.
Of
Get
who?
you and her. Yes,
Yeah.
Treasure and whatever your job is on this.
But
No,
she did it.
I know. Just leave. It's okay.